Hey y'all, you know we're a nonprofit, right? That means we rely on donations from listeners to keep this podcast going. So if you have a couple of dollars to spare, because every dollar counts, please consider giving at patreon.com/femfreak. Also, fun fact, in addition to the perks that you'll get as a Patreon subscriber, your donations and contributions on Patreon are also tax deductible because we're a 501c3. So if you want to learn more, if you want to give, please head over to patreon.com/femfreak.
It's Universal's top moneymaker in 1916, and it's a film written and directed by a woman on abortion and birth control. And so you go, wow, that could never happen even today.
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and we're kicking off an amazing series this week. For the next 7 weeks, we'll be diving deep into film history by watching and discussing landmark films from the beginnings of cinema up through the 1980s. We've got an incredible group of special guests to come on the podcast and discuss the time, social context, and creative movements that birthed these films. And to kick off this series, we're starting with a discussion of Hollywood's early years in the 1910s and 20s, and diving into Shoes, director Lois Weber's 1916 tearjerker about a poor shop girl who sells herself to buy a new pair of shoes.
Ree Daniels,
What the hell is going on here?
are you going to take Johnny away from me?
Take a nap, because you're going to need all your energy tonight.
Silly boy.
Hey everyone, I'm so excited about this new series, and I have some awesome guests joining me. First up, we've got Dr. Shelley Stamp, writer and professor of film and digital media at UC Santa Cruz, and our friend, Dr. Ebony Adams. Do you like that I added doctor for the first time ever?
I do. Listeners to the podcast, I have returned to drop some knowledge on you. Psych, I'm leaving it all to Shelley.
Yeah, you don't have any knowledge here. What are you
not in this field. Not in this field. So, and I'm unashamed to be straight up about that.
Shelley, I'm so excited to have you on the show. You helped us out when we wrote the Lois Weber section of our book, Ebony and I's History versus Women. You moderated our conversation in Santa Cruz. Yep. I annoyed the crap out of you for an episode of a show that I was doing about Lois Weber. And I don't know, you're just so wonderful and
I can't believe you
with
keep
your time.
taking
I know.
Anita's calls because I am about to stop.
It's true.
I am so happy to be here. I'm such a fan of Feminist Frequency. So I love that you're delving into my early cinema period. So I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I have so much respect for the work that you do. And you literally wrote the book on Lois Weber, which I found not only enormously useful in my research, but like it's really good. Like I actually just enjoy sometimes these books can be a little but like I was like, wow, this is like really like what a fascinating character. You have such a lovely way of writing. And I've learned so much about this film period through you and the things that you've the scholarship that you've introduced me to. So I want to get into it. Like this is the beginning of Hollywood. I think that the average person, or I guess like the non-scholar probably just thinks of Charlie Chaplin or, like silent movies that are a little bit goofy and don't really get how much women were involved during this period of time. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about how this industry kind of started?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a piece of Hollywood history that I wish more people knew about, because when the industry was forming in the 1910s, so over 100 years ago, when the industry was consolidating in and around LA, there were tremendous opportunities for lots of people. Film was incredibly popular. Movie theaters would change their programs every few days, if not every day. So there's a tremendous need for films. And there were opportunities for lots of people, including women. And the industry was a lot more fluid. So it was easier to move. If you were interested in writing, you could write something and then maybe also direct it. Or if you were interested in acting, you could probably do some directing or writing on the side. The roles were a lot more fluid. So there were opportunities for lots of women in this early industry. And there were many, many women who were involved in the early days of filmmaking in different ways. So let me give you some examples. One way would be, to work at one of the early movie studios. So a studio like Universal in the 1910s, which had its huge Universal City facility built by 1915, a huge, modern filmmaking facility, was home to many, many female filmmakers. Universal released close to 200 films directed by women in the 1910s alone. Right. So that's a possibility. And there was a kind of community of women that worked there, including Lois Weber, who mentored a lot of women who also wanted to direct. Women who acted under her later moved into directing because of her mentorship. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it, there were women who worked outside of Hollywood, who worked on their own. So Marion Wong founded the Mandarin Film Company in Oakland, California, and made the first all Asian American cast feature film there on her outside of Hollywood, right? Nell Shipman worked in remote northern Idaho and in Canada making action adventure films. Zora Neale Hurston made ethnographic films among Black communities in Florida at a time when nobody was documenting those communities. Angela Marie Gibson worked in Castleton, North Dakota, and made films with members of her own family, right? She had a tiny little production company. So there was all sorts of women who were making all kinds of films during these years in many, many different ways. And like I say, I wish this history were better known, because the women who are making films now, the women who are aspiring to be filmmakers now, have a long history of predecessors that they don't know about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, film equipment was not what it was today. How did anybody outside of studios have access to the equipment?
Well, in many ways, the equipment was a little simpler in those days because there wasn't sound and the cameras were hand cranked, right? So you didn't need, at first, at least, you didn't need an electric generator. You didn't need a lot of stuff. You just needed a camera box and some celluloid film. Remember that stuff? The old, actual film strip, and somebody who could crank the camera. So it was relatively easy and relatively inexpensive. Once, and it was easier to shoot on location. It was easier to shoot on the fly, right? You could use natural sunlight. You didn't need lighting rigs, right? So the early days, it's much more of an artisanal industry than of course it even becomes in the 20s and 30s, let alone now, right? So it's easier. The whole thing is easier. The technology is easier. It's less expensive. In a way that makes it accessible to people and it makes it artisanal, in the same way that there's a kind of fluidity of roles, right? Where you can it's less defined to be, the notion of a director isn't even known in these early days, right? So somebody who pens a few notes writing a script might also tell people where to stand in front of the camera, and that counts as directing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
At what point do you start to then get a sense that film is something, and the craft of filmmaking is something that can be learned, that there is an appropriate pathway to entering certain fields, that there are, appropriate ways of doing things, of shooting things, of, writing a script, et cetera? At what point does that come to be?
That's a really good question, because I think what starts to happen, as early as the early 20s, let's say, when power is consolidating in Hollywood studios, right? With names that we still remember, like Universal and Paramount. Power is consolidating in those studios, and filmmaking has become much more studio bound. And there is the rise of professional trade guilds in that early days. And I hate to say it, but in many ways, the trade guilds are partly responsible for keeping out women, keeping out people of color. This is also a period when there's lots of Black film making companies, right, in the 1910s, right? And the trade guilds are partly responsible for, what they think of as roots of professionalization, but which become roadblocks. The early days of kind of low-key artisanal filmmaking that allow lots of people to enter in the business, where there's these informal networks of mentoring, particularly women mentoring women, right? Get a little stifled in the trade guilds. I hate to say, right, but that is a reality. That is a part of it. Right.
The history of the studio consolidation it's kind of a pattern where at the beginning stages of a new industry, there are more women and people of color, experimenting and playing around. And then as soon as like men, especially white men, are like, oh, money can be made, they come in and take over. And like this happened with tech as one example. It also happened with beer making. I started researching this, that like beer making was a very gendered, like women gendered profession until it was taken over. So
yeah,
there you go. Men suck. It's fine. But that's what it does feel like, that, right? Like we talk about Lois Weber being one of the great filmmakers of the time that everybody knew, and like people don't even know her name today.
Exactly.
Right? But we still know the names of like Cecil B. DeMille and others of that time. Like she just got lost.
Yeah. You're making a really important point, right? Which is when power consolidates, in not just in film, but in other industries, right? And what happens in film is that my colleague, the business historian Karen Ward Mahar, has this great theory about the remasculinization of the film industry. And what she says is that when the studios have to finance all of the kind of conglomeration in the 1920s, they have to borrow money from banks, and they buy into a sort of idea about corporate America that is highly masculinized, and that's part of how women get shut out. But what I was starting to say is that part of shutting out women is also shutting out the history, is forgetting the history, and that's what's so important. And I completely agree with you. It's not just the film industry; it's other industries that get where women get pushed out and people of color get pushed out, and the history gets rewritten, and that's. It's a two-step
erasure,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. What I found so interesting learning about this period was one, the first thing was how many women were involved. Just generally, I feel like that's kind of shocking in and of itself if one is new to this. But that when we think about this time period, early 1900s, late 1800s, like it wasn't great for women in the world, right? I'm thinking about people like Anthony Comstock, who was creating all the indecency laws. He was a postmaster general or something like that, who created all these like deep restrictions on any, quote unquote, lewd material. And so with that context, like literally he was going through the mail and like taking porn and birth control out, and like even if a love letter was written, you could get in trouble for that. So like with that context, there's all of these movies about abortion and sex work and poverty, like really fascinating that was happening in this social context.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, and I think too that at the same time as Comstock is doing his thing, and you're absolutely right about that, right? There are also in the first couple of decades of the 20th century really important social movements driven by women, right? The women's suffrage movement, the campaign to legalize contraception, the temperance campaign, right? Led by women, really powerful social movements. And so there is an energy around women's political engagement, and people see the power that women have to drive the social narrative, right? And this is also this is a period of the quote unquote new woman, right? So there is an understanding that codes of femininity are changing, particularly for white women, right? That involve engagement in politics and social justice, that involve perhaps work in the paid labor force, right? That involve athleticism, that involve being involved in commercial entertainment culture like amusement parks or movies or public dance halls, right? The word feminism is coined in 1913, right? So there is an understanding of that there is a kind of new engagement that women have with society that takes many different forms, right? Depending on your class, depending on your race, right? But it's there and it's visible. And I think that the work that female filmmakers are doing in this period is part of that much larger movement, right? They're really seizing their power. First of all, to enter this brand new profession. And the female filmmakers are really thought of as kind of models of this new kind of femininity, right? Working in this modern industry. And as you say, they're not just doing that, which would be one thing. They are taking it all on, and they're making films about the campaign, as you say, the campaign to legalize contraception. Lois Weber makes 2 films about legalizing birth control and about abortion. She makes a film about capital punishment. She makes a film about drug addiction. She makes films about poverty. She makes films about religious hypocrisy. She in particular, right, isn't afraid to take on these questions, but other women too are making films about prostitution, or they're making action adventure serials that show women to be strong and athletic and brave and smart, or they're remaking Westerns, kind of conventional genres in ways that foreground female heroism, right? So you're absolutely right. It's not just that they're making films, which would be modern enough. They're really taking on some important social discussions of the day, and really thinking of film as a medium that can speak to people in very important ways, right? That can speak to a mass audience in really important ways.
Is there a distinction between the types of films that women are creating in this period and the ones that men are creating in this period? I mean, and I'd also love for you to talk a bit about how does someone go about doing the work that you do, knowing that, there's a bit of survivorship bias, right? Like you can study easier the things that, you can still get access to. So there, I'm sure are tons of things that maybe we know the names of, that we've got summaries of that you've never seen, but where do we look to find firsthand materials that we can study?
Well, those are great questions. The first question is so important. Is there a difference between the films that women made in this era and the films that men made? Absolutely. And it's a really important question to talk about because it's still a question that's with us, right? Why is it important that we have female filmmakers or female creators in any field? It's incredibly important. And, let me give you a couple of examples of, how films by women in this era were different from films by men. First of all, because of how history got written, the image of femininity that we have from this period is too often dominated by the films of D.W. Griffith, right? So we have this image of frail, white, childlike femininity that's in, need of rescue, and that was out of step with the time, right? And what you see in films made by women is that there are almost all are driven by female protagonists, but women's experience is central to films made by women. So almost all female protagonists, not frail, childlike women in need of rescue, but also films in which women are active agents of change. Whether you're talking about, drug addiction or poverty, women are active agents of change in their own lives and the lives of others. And, women are, in the action adventure films or the Western films, they're smart and brave and cunning. In the comedy films of somebody like Mabel Normand, right, who's making slapstick right alongside Charlie Chaplin. In fact, she directs Chaplin before he directs himself. She's smart and funny about gender, about heterosexual dating culture. So absolutely, women are making different kinds of films that foreground women's experience and female protagonists, right? And so it's so important to have women in positions of creative control in this new industry is so important. And again, unfortunately we're still having to answer this question now. It's as important now as it was then, right? And you know, and the women at the time were very vocal about this. So you know, Lois Weber said, well, you know, I might not get some of the things that my male counterpart, my male directors see, but I see things they don't see. Such a fundamentally simple observation, right? So absolutely. And then your second question, Ebony, was about kind of like how we get at this history, which is a trickier question because, you know, you're right that you know, the early histories of Hollywood that were written, you know, the first histories of Hollywood were written in the late 20s and early 30s. That Hollywood started writing its own history pretty early on, right? Before even sound came in, they start writing their own history. And those early histories already erase women, already forget that there's women who were, you know, very powerful filmmakers, and that, you know, all of the top screenwriters in early Hollywood were women. And that's forgotten almost instantaneously. But there is, you know, there has been, you know, since the 1970s, you know, sort of since second wave feminism, the women's liberation era. So what has that been? 50 years? There has been a concerted effort to try and get at this history. And more and more of the films are available. The films are being preserved and the films are being circulated, you know, on disc and on streaming services. So you can see the films. That used to be a huge problem, right? You couldn't see the films. You know, and luckily many of these women saw in the early 20s that they were being written out of history. And so they wrote their own history, right? So, you know, Mabel Normand wrote her own history in the late 20s and had it published in a trade magazine. Jean Gantier wrote a history of early filmmaking and had it published in a Woman's Home Companion, like a women's magazine. Mel Shipman wrote her own history and had it published. Alice Guy Blaché, you know, went around with and knocked on the doors of French academics in France before she died to ensure that her legacy got written into film history. So it's possible, and there are a lot of us now that are doing this work. And I have to say, it's very joyful work, right? To be involved in kind of excavating work that isn't well known and writing about it, but also like making it available for other people to see and other people to teach in, you know, in high school classrooms and university classrooms. I've been involved in at AFI, the American Film Institute has a educational initiative. And so I've been involved in writing high school curriculum for shoes, which has been so wonderful to think that, oh my goodness, high school students might see this film and might learn about this history.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what it was like to be a female moviegoer in this period of time. Like, what was that experience?
Well, for one thing, female audiences were taken really seriously in these early years, right? The industry, you know, in the earliest days of the industry, there was the film industry at first didn't have a lot of respectability, right? It was sort of considered a kind of tawdry entertainment that catered mainly to urban working class populations, mainly men. And so when the industry started kind of consolidating in Hollywood, there was an effort to lend the medium a little more respectability. And part of that involved catering to white middle class women, right? to sort of get in on their respectability train of white middle class women. And so, you know, the film industry in the the mid to late 1910s in particular is really catering to women, and they're all kinds of different women. So they're making action adventure serials like The Perils of Pauline that feature young white women protagonists in an effort to cater to young women, right? The kinds of social issue films that Lois Weber is making at Universal that feature social issues like birth control and capital punishment that have these kind of female protagonists are also catering to women, right? So if you were a woman going to the movies in the 1910s, you'd probably go several times a week, right? That was quite typical, right? You might stop in on your way home from work. You might stop in on your lunch hour. If you are a homemaker, you might stop in the middle of the day with your kids after you've gone shopping for your groceries. You might stop in after dinner, right? You might bring your husband and your kids after dinner, right? So people went to the movies a lot. They went to kind of neighborhood-based theaters, or the theaters in urban entertainment districts if they were working or shopping in town, right? And they would be socializing in the theater, probably. They might meet friends there. They might bring friends, coworkers with them, right? So it was a very, movie theaters were a part of many people's daily lives, and were real kind of social centers in their communities, right? If you were a Black woman in Chicago, you would go to a theater that catered to Black patrons that probably had local jazz playing. And scholars of this have argued that in a way there might be a kind of counterpoint to the sort of racist films that are coming out of Hollywood, in that being viewed by a Black audience accompanied by Black jazz, right? So there was kind of an amazing film-going culture of this period, and an amazing fan culture. This is early fan magazines of this period are publishing all sorts of tidbits about movie stars and their closets and their bedrooms and their habits, right? So
this is when you start getting like the gossip columnists like Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper, who were kind of nightmares by our standards today. But yeah, like there's a episode or a series on You Must Remember This, which is a podcast that talks about 20th century Hollywood, it's called Gossip Girls, and it's all about the two of them. And oh boy, they make people's lives difficult.
Absolutely. Oh, no, that is I love that podcast in general, and I love that series of it in particular. It's really, really great.
Also, what great name! Sorry, totally derailing us, but Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper are like the best. Like, just such like super, like, I don't know, comic.
They're very evocative. What they did.
Yeah.
I know we're going to transition into talking about shoes in a bit. But before we do that, I want to ask, when you're talking to students or, just someone who's interested in checking out films of this period, how are you preparing them to understand these films, right? Because they are different. They're very similar in some ways. And we're all kind of, a little bit familiar with the tropes of, silent film, but nevertheless, to sit down and watch an entire film from this period, from start to finish, how are you telling people to watch it and to understand what's being done?
That's a great question. And I, honestly, I teach a silent cinema class here at UC Santa Cruz fairly regularly. And even seasoned film students who love film come into that class, they admit to me, dreading a little bit, an entire term of silent film. And I'm proud to say they come out the other end saying, wow, those films are great. And I think the way to think about it is to think about silent cinema not as an inferior cousin to the kind of films we have now, but as, in a way, a different approach to cinema, which is to approach cinema as a wholly visual medium. I think that a lot of film content now and TV content now, you can kind of half watch if you're listening to the dialogue, right?
Right.
Silent cinema is not like that. You have to watch. And the acting is different. The acting is phenomenal. It's different, but it's phenomenal, right? The range of emotions that can be conveyed on somebody's face in close-up in silent cinema is stunning. Right. And Shoes is a great example of that. Right.
Right.
The performance that Mary McLaren gives. Right. So much is visible on her face. And so you have to be attentive in a different way. Right. This is a visual storytelling medium, and the emotional impact is being conveyed through the way someone carries their body, the emotions that cross their face. Right. So it demands a kind of different kind of viewing. In my mind, it's equally pleasurable, right? And a beautifully restored silent film will look spectacular and will have a fabulous musical score to accompany it that helps orchestrate our emotions too, right? In the same way that the performances do. I mean, I think too often, some of the reason that people dread watching silent film is that we've been watching horrible copies that you can barely see, that are screened at the wrong speed. So people are moving in a jerky way, that have some pre-recorded soundtrack slapped onto them that wasn't written for that film at all, right? So throw away that idea, right? Watch a film that's been restored, that has a score written for it, and your eyes will be opened to this beautiful medium, the possibilities of the medium.
Yeah. So yeah, you recommended that we watch Shoes among many. We had many options. And can you like, why was that something that you thought would be interesting for us to watch? Can you kind of set it up? It's from 1916, so kind of smack dab in the middle of this time period that we're talking about.
I mean, Shoes is a film that's very close to my heart. I first saw Shoes in 1999. That's how old I am. In a screening in Amsterdam where they didn't have English titles, and it was in very poor shape. But I loved it the moment I saw it. So it's a film made by Lois Weber in 1916, kind of at the height of her power and renown, right? When she makes this film, she's Universal's top director. She's one of the top 3 directors probably in early Hollywood, alongside D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille. And she is at the height of her power making films about social issues. And in Shoes, she takes on urban poverty and women's wage equity. Right. Those are the issues she takes on, which are issues that sociologists at the time were thinking about. Right. And so the central character in the film, Ava Meyer, is a shop girl. She works in a 5 and dime store, surrounded by commercial goods, her every day. And what we see is that what we learn in the film is that labor, which is very modestly compensated, supports almost her entire family, right? She's got little sisters, she's got a mother and her father. Her mother takes in washing, which is a sort of older form of women's labor to support a family. Her father doesn't work. Her father spends his day drinking beer, reading dime novels, and smoking on his pipe, right? And her very modestly paid labor supports the entire family. And so Weber kind of weaves a story, this kind of simple story, right, about a shop girl. And a very melodramatic story, as you said, Anita, right? But she weaves into that a call for women's wage equity, right? A call to stop underpaying these shop girls, and a call for us to recognize how important their labor is in many families. Right? So I think I wanted to, I guess that I'm saying I wanted us to talk about it for 2 reasons. One, it's close to my heart, but also it's a real testament of the kind of power of cinema in this era, the power that Weber really saw in cinema and wanted to use, right? Because it's a film that tugs on your heartstrings, but in a way that helps us, that's done quite strategically to help us, to put us in Ava's shoes, for lack of a better metaphor, right? It really helps us understand her plight in a way that's very
because
powerful.
we spend quite a bit of time watching what might be considered like a kind of banal accumulation of scenes with the family, right? Like we spend quite a bit of time with Ava working, and then in the family home, and then walking on the street or having lunch in a park or whatever. And I think modern audiences, not everyone, but many modern viewers are accustomed to a faster pace, in our movies. And every scene has to propel you into the next scene and has to have a sort of, like action rationale for it, right? And so you really, as you said, you need to be attentive in a different way and perhaps more fully than, you have been recently when you watch a film like Shoes. And I did have to kind of settle into it, once it began. I knew what was going to happen. I knew approximately, how long the film was, and my brain is working and I'm thinking, okay, so when is like, the act 1 break gonna happen? And I'm thinking of that kind of stuff, anticipating what's gonna happen. And the film resists that. It makes you take your time. And because you take your time learning about what life is like for Ava, it is that much more heartrending once she finally reaches her breaking point, and those shoes literally reach their breaking point. And I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but there were moments where I was cracking up in this movie. And every time we saw her pitiful shoes, I lost it. I just lost it. Her dad was funny to me, just chilling, did not care, drinking beer from a tin can. It looked like
I was like, is
Cabaret
that a
Charlie?
piss bucket or a beer bucket? I was like, when he took a sip, I was like, oh, I guess it's not.
He was so comfortable, bed in the middle of the room, just chilling, could not care less what was going on in the rest of the house.
But we see that through her eyes, like she's standing in the doorway watching him, right? And the look of disdain on her face is absolutely crucial, right?
Yeah.
We see.
I had to resist that same urge, Ebony, where I was like, cool, I got it. Like, I got it. She's poor and needs new shoes. Like, and you're just like, why are we still here? And you do have to, like, we're so used to like cut every 10 seconds, cut, that you do have to settle in and be like, they're taking their time with the story. And, and you see a lot of our filmmaking conventions otherwise are there, right? Like where there are inserts, which is where you cut to somebody's hands or the way that we edit and tell stories today are very similar to how stories were told back then and films were told back then, which I have not watched a lot of silent movies. So that kind of, I don't know why that surprised me, but I was like, how many setups did they have to do? What, how many takes did they do? I actually started reading about the film because I was like, how did they build these sets? They actually when she's in the shop, they actually brought in recreated an entire shop on set, which is kind of a big deal at the time. And then also apparently they made the whole room. They recreated the whole set of the room, not just little pieces of it here and there, as may have been the norm. I read all this on Wikipedia, so fuck if this is accurate or not. But I was so curious about how they would shoot this, right? Like, who are all these extras? Where is all this stuff happening?
Yeah, and there was there was news at the time that was part of the sort of the publicity around the film, is that Weber was bringing all of this realism, right? And that the mother was actually cooking cabbage on the stove, on the set in the house, right? That the same thing.
You saw the steam of the water when they poured the water in. I was like, oh, that's real boiling water.
Yeah.
Damn. Yeah. But what you're saying about what you're both saying about the slowness is absolutely true. And I should have said that, right? And prepping people to watch silent film, it's going to be a slower pace for sure. You have to settle in. But what you're saying, Anita, about the techniques are of that by 1916, all of the techniques of kind of continuity editing and kind of classical Hollywood storytelling are there, right? And are used, Weber's very smart visual storyteller. And so, the point of view shot that we get of the desired boots in the shop window is so fabulous. I mean, it's so fabulous because they're there behind, they're on a little platform, right, suspended in the air behind glass, and poor Ava is passing them every day on her way back and forth to work. And it's such a lovely visual metaphor of how she sees them, but they're unattainable. Right. And how she needs them. She's on her feet all day long behind the counter in the store. And as you're saying, Ebony, we see her poor bare feet, through the holes in her soles. And
it was so sad.
It was, but every time the camera panned down to those shoes, I don't know. I'm a horrible person, y'all. It was high comedy to me because those shoes had enough and she had to keep cutting out cardboard for them. Oh my goodness. Oh my! And
I was like, "Where are you getting all these boxes from? When are you going to run out of boxes?"
That was the question I had.
Okay, she keeps opening a dresser and boxes keep coming out. You're like, "All right."
Well, she knew her family wasn't shit.
Yeah.
Okay, so Shelley, talk to us about actors in this period, right? So, are most of the actors in these films, are these people new to film who have never acted before, or are they largely coming from vaudeville, et cetera? And sort of what kind of performance conventions are they bringing to film, or is it completely different? Are they having to sort of relearn performance for this different format and genre?
That's a great question, and it really varies. Lois Weber was really interested in getting people from the theater, what was called the legitimate stage, right, into movies, because it was very disreputable for people involved in the theater to act in movies at first. And Weber was really instrumental in kind of getting people from the theater into film. She had started, right, in theater. And so she was interested in that move. That said, the star of Shoes, Mary McLaren, was only a film actress, had been really kind of discovered and promoted by Weber. Weber made her a star. Weber kind of trained her as an actress. And because really the conventions of acting for the stage and the conventions of acting for the film camera are totally different, right? Especially in this period. In the earlier period, when there was predominantly, long shots where you're seeing the full body and not close-ups, then the theater conventions of kind of how you carry your body on stage translated into film. But by 1916, where stories are being told predominantly in close-up and medium shot, where you're seeing a lot of the human face, you need a totally different style of acting than you get on the stage, right? And so somebody like McLaren, who has such an expressive face, is really suited to movies. And so Weber was really instrumental in kind of moving her. She has a kind of tiny bit part in Where Are My Children, which is one of Weber's abortion and birth control films. She's got a tiny part in that. And then she stars, Weber kind of sees her potential, and she stars in several of Weber's other films. But this is her, I think, kind of masterful performance here.
As I started diving into Weber's canon, I was so fascinated by the fact that there's this woman who was making all these movies about abortion and social issues, but they weren't always progressive, right? Where this one I feel like is, I'd say more progressive, right? It's, the costs of, poverty and wages and, the costs of sex work and all of the things that it comes up in this. But, she's made abortion movies that you're I was like, holy shit, you're making movies about abortion in, the 1910s and 20s, but they're eugenics almost. They get kind of messy.
Yeah. I wouldn't even say eugenics almost. They are.
Yeah, they kind of are.
No, thank you for bringing that up, because sometimes it's awkward to say. Everybody wants to make Lois Weber into being the perfect heroine of early cinema. And it's very, very complicated. So a film like Where Are My Children, like I just mentioned, right? So this is a film, it's Universal's top moneymaker in 1916, and it's a film written and directed by a woman on abortion and birth control. And so you go, wow, that could never happen even today, right? You can't imagine a world in which Universal would greenlight a film written and directed by a woman on abortion and birth control, let alone it would be their top box office. So that's all great. But as you say, it's a film about abortion and birth control where wealthy white women are vilified for having repeated abortions, right? And there is a very clear discourse about a eugenic marriage that is where the woman there is gleefully having children, right? So there's a sort of vilification of abortion in order to prop up another strand of the film, which is advocating legalized contraception, but for working class women and women on their own, right? And so there's a sort of split in the film about who ought to be reproducing and who ought not to be reproducing, and who should have access to legal contraception, right? And so that's a eugenics argument, flat out, right? And so Where Are My Children is a perfect example of sort of complexity of the campaign for legal contraception during this era, right? Which was really in bed with, for lack of a better metaphor, the eugenics movement, right? And so Weber is a part of that. And in even the second film she makes on birth control, which is The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, she kind of takes on she herself acts in the film as a sort of birth control advocate, very Margaret Sanger-like character, right? An advocate for legalized contraception who's imprisoned, right, for her beliefs. But again, there's the kind of argument about certain, birth control is more appropriate for certain women than others, right? And so that's a reality of some of these of the movements at the time, and a filmmaker like Weber. And I don't think we should hide it. I think we need to talk about that as part of her legacy, right?
Well, and I think it's, I think it's such an important part of, like you said, it's complicated. People are complicated. This history is complicated. Activist movements are complicated. And just as we all are today as well in how we navigate things. And so I think there's space to celebrate her existence and her achievements, and also be like, that shit was fucked up. That's not the right side of history here,
Right.
I wonder how how she was one of the highest paid directors in Hollywood at one period of time, which is incredible. There's this quote from her that says, she's expressing dismay about how much the studios are taking over. And she's like, it's one thing to edit my films or to edit the scripts and blah, blah, blah. But it's another thing to cut them, right? It's another thing to have final say or whatever. I'm wondering, what was her relationship with studios? Did she get pushback, or did she kind of have free reign to talk about whatever she wanted?
That's a great question. And I would say it really shifts in her career, right? So when she's making Shoes, when she's making Where Are My Children, the birth control film we just talked about, she's at the height of her power, right? And reporters who visit Universal talk about how everybody is coming to her for advice on one thing or another. They talk about how she works 48 hours straight in the editing room with a sandwich in one hand and a script in the other. She has full control, when she is at Universal, over pre-production, production, and post-production, absolutely full control. She is so powerful that in 1917, she leaves Universal and forms her own studio, Lois Weber Productions. She rents a residential estate on Santa Monica Boulevard. She outfits the house as this huge production facility. She signs incredibly lucrative distribution deals, first with Universal and then with Paramount. So there too, she has a lot of power. That starts to shift in the kind of late days of her distribution deal with Paramount. So we're talking about 1921, when that period when studios are starting to consolidate power. And she makes a film called What Do Men Want?, which is an indictment of masculinity and features the public suicide of a pregnant young woman who's been spurned by her lover, right? She commits suicide, and Paramount calls Weber to New York and says, "We're not going to distribute this film. No, we're not going to distribute
And
this."
do you think that they would have, at the height of her power, like she would have been like, yes, we like, do you think it had to do more with her and her power position than it did with like the cultural environment?
I think it's about the shift from 1916 to 1921,
The time period.
and
right.
the difference in the film industry, and also the difference in kind of ideas about how socially engaged films should be, right? By 1921, it's the jazz age. There's a sort of different model of femininity, which is the flapper, right? Not the socially conscious filmmaker. And there's a different idea about that film should be entertainment, right? And that Hollywood should be about glamour. And so this film, the kind of films that Weber is making in 1921, which I think that would have flown at Universal in 1916, right? In fact, there is a suicide scene in Where Are My Children, right? A very similar scene, right? A pregnant young woman flings herself off the bridge, right? So Weber is still making that kind of film in 1921, and the industry and the culture has moved on, right? So I think that's what's happened. And then, towards the end of her career, she gets very, very vocal, right? She continues to work, her studio, her production company collapses in 1921, right? And she continues, she goes back to Universal, and she tries various modes of working in the industry, through the early 30s. But she gets increasingly vocal in the late 20s about how different the industry is to work in, right? And about how she talks. In 1927, she writes a 2-part newspaper column, and she says, it used to be when I walked on the set, I got immediate respect, right? Everybody knew who I was. Now I walk on the set, and I don't get respect. The crew that works with me aren't used to working with women, and they don't respect me in the way I used to be respected. And she says, we need more women directors. She's making this call in 1927, right? Because the number of female filmmakers has dropped dramatically by the late 20s. And she says, we need more. So she gets quite vocal about how the industry shifts.
Wow.
So towards the end of the 20s is when we start getting talkies, right?
Yes, 1927.
And that also, so that kind of caps out the end of this era that we're talking about, which propels us into the 30s, which feels like a very different landscape, or very different, yeah. So she basically, did she make any talkies? Did she kind of?
She did. Her last film is a sound film. It was the first film shot on location on the island of Kauai. She took a boatload of generators to Kauai and made a film in 1934, which is kind of astonishing, right? The first filmmaker to shoot on location there. And it's a lost film. It's a film called White Heat, which was, at that point, she was working for a kind of low budget Poverty Row studio. That's kind of where she was in 1934. That was where she could get money to make films. And it's a film about, set on the sugarcane plantation on Kauai, about an interracial relationship, right, between a Native Hawaiian woman and a white man. And uncharacteristically for that time, the Native Hawaiian woman does not die at the end of the
But it's called White Heat.
It's called White Heat, yeah.
Oh my God.
That's amazing.
And
that reminds me of some articles that you had sent, Shelley, when I was doing research about, like, they called Vice films like white slavery films, and I was just like, oh, can we not call them that? Just the whole time, like, it's a fascinating history, but just cringy every single time I had to read that sentence.
Now that you've brought up talkies, Anita, do I have time for another question before we?
Of course.
Okay, so I'm watching Shoes, and Mary McLaren, who plays Ava, she's got such a unique face. But one of the things that I noticed is how large her eyes appear, and how crucial that is during the silent film era, right? Like to have a very expressive, emotive face. And so I would love for you to talk a bit about how the requirements of film in this period sort of help create, beauty standards in that period outside of film. And then I'm thinking also, as we head into talkies, and so now we're actually hearing actors speak, right? Does this then contribute to what we consider an American sound, because now we have a sample of how people from New York sound and how Chicago sound and whatever, right? Like now that we can hear these things, does that contribute to the way that we construct like a kind of a national sound?
Yes. Yeah. Yes to both questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, yes, in the sense of absolutely. The earliest stars, in the 1910s, are absolutely contributing to beauty standards, right? In the earliest days of Hollywood, the female stars in particular are already part of endorsement and tie-in campaigns for cosmetics. They're already writing, kind of beauty hints columns in fan magazines, and that as you say, that kind of look that so many of those early female stars have, white women with curly, light-colored hair that's often accentuated through kind of halo lighting of backlighting that gives them a kind of halo, right? Large eyes. That's a real standard of beauty in the 1910s, right? That shifts in the 20s, right? We already talked about flapper, so the flapper style is a little different, and there's a new generation of stars like Colleen Moore and Clara Bow that are flat-chested and slim-hipped, that have short hair, right? Short bobbed hair. So absolutely movie stars are part of the standard of beauty. And of course, as they still are today. And your question about sound is true as well. So, quite famously, it's very few silent era actors that are able to make the transition into sound film because for many reasons. First of all, the style of acting required is very, very different, right? And the voice is so important. And so what happens in that transition to sound in 1920, and it happens very fast, right? Sound comes in 27 and within 2 years, virtually all films are sound, right? And so there's a huge industry in dialect coaches being employed by actors, and a whole new generation of performers that come from the stage, right? And then there is a kind of transatlantic accent that gets popularized, right? And so accents that are marked by region, accents that are marked by class, accents that are marked by, an international accent, English as a second language, all of those kind of speech markers are often really problematic, right? And they are, and that kind of transatlantic accent that if you put on any film from the 1930s, that sort of style of speaking, right? And that's a product of Hollywood dialect coaches, right? That are coaching that transatlantic accent. If you think of the way Katharine Hepburn speaks in films of the 30s, or Cary Grant speaks in films of the 30s, it's a particular way of speaking, right? And I don't think all Americans could speak that way or did speak that way, but it was a kind of,
it felt like a performative, like it's not real. It was It was to create a division, like a special glamour around Hollywood, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating.
This was amazing.
Yeah, it was.
As I expected it to be. I learned so much. Shelley, thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
Where can folks find you, or any books you want to plug, or anything that you're doing that you want to share with our listeners?
I will, if you're interested in learning more about Lois Weber, my book is called Lois Weber in Early Hollywood. Have a read if you're interested. If you're interested in kind of early female audiences, I have a book called Movie Struck Girls, which is about kind of female audiences of this era and women's suffrage films and action adventure films and all that kind of stuff. And if you want to see more films, I curated a 6-disc set, which is called Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers. You can buy the 6-disc set from Kino Lorber. Selections are streaming on Netflix. If you search your Netflix queue for Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers, you'll see a bunch of films will come up. Shoes you can stream online as well through Milestone. So those are some ways to sort of dig more into this if you're interested. Awesome. You can find me at UC Santa Cruz. If you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to connect with you.
You share opinions on social media. Can people find you on Twitter, Instagram, or anything?
I'm very active on Twitter. Yes. So you can, I'm Stamp Shelley on Twitter, and I am very opinionated about
that's what we want.
Women in Hollywood in particular. I will.
Come on. Yeah. Love it. Love it.
Hey, Ebony, now that you're a guest, where can people find your nonsense?
You can always find me on Twitter. I rarely tweet, but
That's not true.
retweet.
I saw you tweeting today.
Yeah, but I mean, compared to how I used to, be on Twitter much more. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Ebony Aster. If you disagree with anything I say or you have questions, feel free to hit me up. I won't respond, but I want you to feel as if you have opportunities to express yourself. And anywhere else you can find me, go to WIF.org. Y'all know my day job's at Women in Film. I program over there, so get to know me.
Awesome. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Next week, we're going to be diving into the 30s. So more of the talkies and studio system and all that fun stuff. Our show is engineered by Rob Pera. Carrie Stimson provides technical support, artwork by Jamie Varon, and our intro music is by Phil Circus. Thanks, y'all, for listening.
Bye.
Bye.